I never thought a quiet morning of fishing could turn into a battle that would consume my life. But there I was, at the edge of my favorite lake, rod in hand, just waiting for the sun to rise and the water to ripple. With the first bite of the day, that peace, the serenity I had treasured for years, shattered the moment a letter from the HOA landed in my mailbox. It wasn't just a warning. It was a fine, $250 for fishing. Yes, fishing. According to the HOA, enjoying the lake like I had for decades was now a punishable offense. My jaw dropped as I read and reread the letter. Rules, regulations, covenants, none of it made sense. My neighbors had fished there for years without issue. But suddenly the HOA decided I was the criminal. I called their office immediately, trying to reason with someone on the other end. But all I got was a robotic voice and a terse, "It's policy. Pay or face further penalties." My frustration turned to anger. How could an organization, which I barely had a say in, dictate my access to water I had the legal right to enjoy? I walked down to the lake, staring at the calm water, imagining the absurdity of being told I couldn't cast a line. That's when the thought hit me. A spark that would change everything. Why should I ask permission to do something that was rightfully mine? Why let a group of self-appointed enforcers control the lake? If I couldn't fish freely, maybe it was time to take control of the lake itself. The idea seemed bold, reckless even. But the more I considered it, the more perfect it became. I spent hours researching ownership laws, HOA loopholes, and real estate options. The concept of buying the lake wasn't as impossible as I initially thought. In fact, it was feasible. And if I owned it, not only could I fish without restrictions, but I could also flip the rules entirely, setting my own terms, and perhaps teaching the HOA a lesson they wouldn't forget. By sunset, I made a decision that would mark the beginning of one of the boldest moves of my life. I was going to buy the lake, and when I did, the neighborhood would have to play by my rules. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about reclaiming control and standing up to an organization that thought it could dictate every inch of my life. After making the decision to buy the lake, I knew this wouldn't be easy. The HOA had more resources, connections, and influence than I could have imagined. But I also had determination and a legal path. I spent days poring over property records, checking deed restrictions, and speaking with real estate lawyers who specialized in unusual cases like mine. Every detail mattered. One overlooked clause could derail the entire plan. I learned that the lake was technically under a private water easement tied to surrounding properties, meaning the HOA didn't fully own it. That was my opening. I drafted a strategy to acquire the lake legally, ensuring that once it was under my name, I had full authority to dictate usage. It wasn't just a financial decision, it was a power move. If I played this right, I could take control from the group that had fined me for something as harmless as fishing. I began reaching out to the sellers, negotiating carefully. They could see that I wasn't just another buyer. I had a purpose. My tone was firm but fair, and I made it clear that this wasn't about profit, it was about restoring the lake to someone who would manage it responsibly. Every meeting, every call, brought me closer to a reality that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Meanwhile, the HOA remained oblivious to my plan. They continued sending letters and making threats, confident that their authority was unchallenged. That complacency was their weakness. I started documenting everything, emails, interactions, and even their petty fines, as if building a dossier for the inevitable moment when I would assert my rights. The more they tried to control me, the more motivated I became. Finally, after weeks of negotiations and paperwork, the sale went through. The lake was officially mine. Holding the deed in my hands, I felt an exhilaration unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just ownership, it was liberation. I had turned the tables completely. The HOA could no longer dictate who used the water, how, or when. My patience, research, and strategy had paid off. But owning the lake was just the beginning. I realized I now had the power to set rules that favored fairness, and maybe a little revenge. For years, the HOA had imposed arbitrary fines, restricted enjoyment, and assumed dominance. Now the roles were reversed. I could protect my property, enforce boundaries, and importantly, show the neighborhood and the HOA that I wasn't someone to be trifled with. As I stood by the shore that evening, watching the sun glint across the water, I smiled. This was no longer about one fine, one fishing incident. This was about control, justice, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. And I was just getting started. With the lake officially in my name, I realized that ownership alone wasn't enough. The HOA and some neighbors still assumed they had a claim, an entitlement to its waters. Their letters, snide remarks, and passive-aggressive warnings reminded me that the real battle was just beginning. If I wanted peace, and to send a message, I had to enforce absolute control. I started by posting clear, visible signage around the lake. Private property. Access by owners, permission only. The signs read, bold and unambiguous. I knew the moment anyone saw them, confusion would turn to frustration. Some would scoff, some would scoff, some would be angry, but that was intentional. The goal wasn't popularity, it was authority. The HOA had dictated rules for decades. Now I was taking over, setting the terms on my property. Next, I implemented a registration system. Any visitor had to be approved by me. Boats, fishing gear, even casual swimmers now needed permission. The first few days were tense. I had neighbors driving by, peering over fences, muttering about ownership rights and HOA overreach. I stood my ground. One by one, I enforced the rules firmly but fairly. No exceptions. No favoritism. The lake was mine, and I would dictate its use. The HOA, of course, reacted predictably. Their office called, demanding explanations, threatening legal action, and trying to assert authority they no longer held. I calmly reminded them that ownership, not HOA policy, governed the property. Every letter, every call became an exercise in patience, strategy, and documentation. I didn't need to escalate emotionally. The law and the deed in my name were on my side. Soon, word spread through the neighborhood. Fishermen who once freely cast lines here were now denied access. Complaints grew louder. Emails and phone calls poured in, and the HOA scrambled to assert relevance. But I stayed consistent. The rules were simple. If you weren't invited, you weren't allowed. No exceptions. The lake became a fortress, a symbol of authority, and a subtle lesson in respecting boundaries. By the end of the first week, the change was tangible. The lake was quiet, serene, and entirely under my control. I could fish whenever I wanted, relax without harassment, and enjoy the water as I had always imagined, without interference. More importantly, the HOA and neighborhood learned a critical lesson. You don't bully a property owner without consequences. Standing on the dock, rod in hand, I smiled. The water was calm, my rules were enforced, and I had regained what was always mine. The battle wasn't over emotionally, but strategically, I had won the first major round. My lake was mine, my freedom was restored, and the HOA's authority had been stripped away. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to react. I expected grumbling, but the intensity of their pushback surprised me. Calls, emails, and even uninvited visits began to arrive almost daily. Some neighbors tried to reason, others argued, and a few outright threatened legal action. Their frustration was palpable. They were used to taking liberties, assuming entitlement. But I was no longer someone to negotiate with casually. The lake was mine, and the rules had changed. I quickly realized that passive measures wouldn't be enough. Signage and permission slips were fine, but I needed a clear, unmistakable system that reinforced my authority and made trespassing impossible. I installed visible gates, reinforced docks, and strategically placed cameras to monitor access. Each measure wasn't just practical. It sent a message. The lake was no longer a shared space. My rules weren't suggestions. They were law on my property. The HOA didn't take this quietly. They sent formal letters outlining supposed violations and threatening fines that had no legal standing. I responded carefully, citing the deed, ownership rights, and documented communications. Their attempts at intimidation were futile because I had prepared for this moment. Every interaction I documented, every law I referenced, strengthened my position and demonstrated that the lake was beyond their arbitrary control. Neighbors tried subtle sabotage, too. One boat left adrift near the shore. Another attempted to sneak in under the guise of a morning jog. Each incident was met with firm but controlled action. A polite but assertive explanation of the rules, followed by enforcement when necessary. I wasn't interested in confrontation for its own sake. I wanted compliance, clarity, and authority. Over time, the message spread. Access without approval would no longer be tolerated. By the second week, the transformation was complete. The lake was peaceful again. My fishing was uninterrupted, and the neighborhood began adjusting to the new reality. The HOA's threats lost power. Their authority diminished, and the rebellious neighbors learned that ownership trumped arbitrary fines. The tension remained. But it was now clearly my terms, my property, and my rules that governed the waters. Sitting on the dock that evening, watching the sun reflect off the lake, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about boundaries, respect, and taking action when unfair authority tries to control your life. The neighborhood's pushback had only reinforced one truth. Once you own the space, you define the rules, and I had done just that. Weeks passed since the neighborhood's initial pushback, and slowly but surely, reality settled in. The lake was now mine, and everyone else had to play by my rules. At first, there were murmurs of defiance, neighbors complaining about lost access, HOA members trying to rally support. But those attempts quickly fizzled. The combination of clear signage, controlled access, and documented ownership made any challenge both legally and practically impossible. I took the time to walk the entire perimeter of the lake, inspecting docks, gates, and entry points. Everything was secure. Everything was under my control. The lake, once a source of endless frustration, was now a sanctuary. No fines, no threats, no arbitrary HOA rules, just freedom. And with that freedom came satisfaction. It wasn't just about the fishing anymore. It was about proving a point. I had taken back what was mine and ensured that no organization or neighbor could infringe upon it again. Word traveled quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors sulked. Others begrudgingly accepted the new reality. But all understood one thing. The authority had shifted. What had started as a personal fight over a $250 fine had evolved into a demonstration of power, strategy, and perseverance. I didn't gloat publicly, but the results spoke for themselves. The lake was mine, my rules governed the waters, and the HOA's influence had been nullified. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every time I cast a line, rowed a boat, or simply sat on the dock watching the water shimmer in the sunset, I felt a sense of liberation that went far beyond fishing. I had confronted arbitrary authority, leveraged legal strategy, and executed a bold plan that restored control over my own life. The satisfaction wasn't fleeting. It was profound, a reminder that taking decisive action can reclaim power from even the most entrenched systems. By the end of the month, the neighborhood had adapted. The lake was quiet, peaceful, and fully under my governance. My rules were clear. No uninvited access, no exceptions, no fines imposed by anyone but me. I had created not just a lake I could enjoy freely, but a precedent. Ownership in action trumped bureaucracy and entitlement. Sitting on the dock one last time that evening, rod in hand, I reflected on everything. What began as a simple fishing trip had escalated into a story of rebellion, strategy, and ultimate victory. The HOA had tried to control me. The neighbors had resisted, but in the end, the power belonged to the person willing to fight smart, act decisively, and stand firm. My lake, my rules, my victory, it was complete.